Why do you have my son's eyes? Evelyn Kong had not meant to say the words aloud, but the question escaped before she could stop it. 5-year-old Grace stood barefoot on the polished hallway floor of Junho's private estate, a purple crayon resting between her fingers and a sheet of drawing paper spread beside her knees. Evelyn had arrived 20 minutes earlier without calling ahead, something she had not done in years. She expected her son's staff to become nervous. She expected Daniel Brooks to appear with another carefully worded explanation about Junho being busy. She did not expect a little girl. Grace looked up at the elegant Korean woman standing beneath the chandelier and tilted her head. The gesture made Evelyn's breath catch. Junho had done exactly that as a child whenever he was deciding whether an adult deserved an answer. Same dark eyes, same serious expression. Even the slight crease between her eyebrows was familiar. Who are you? Evelyn asked more softly. The girl considered the question. Grace. Grace what? Before she could answer, a housekeeper appeared at the far end of the corridor, saw Evelyn, and immediately stopped. The reaction was small, but Evelyn noticed small things. She had spent decades in rooms where important truths were hidden behind polite expressions. Where's my son? Evelyn asked. Mr. Kong is expected back shortly, ma'am. Evelyn looked at Grace again. And who does this child belong to? The housekeeper hesitated. That hesitation told Evelyn more than an answer would have. Grace reached for her drawing. I belong to Mommy and Daddy. Evelyn's gaze dropped to the paper. 3 figures stood beneath an enormous yellow sun. One was a tall man in a dark suit. Beside him stood a black woman wearing a blue dress. Between them was a small girl with wild curls and a smile far too large for her face. Above the man, written in uneven purple letters, was one word. Daddy. Evelyn felt the hallway become strangely still. Grace, she said carefully, what is your daddy's name? The child smiled. Daddy. His other name. Grace opened her mouth, but footsteps sounded from behind them. Grace. A woman's voice carried down the corridor. Evelyn turned. Danielle Carter stopped beneath the archway. 6 years had passed since Evelyn had last seen her, but recognition came immediately. Danielle had once moved quietly through a Kong family residence in a maid's uniform, carrying linens and serving coffee while people with expensive watches barely looked at her. She was not wearing a uniform now. She wore a simple cream sweater and dark slacks, and there was nothing uncertain about the way she stood. Grace jumped to her feet. Mommy! She ran across the hallway and wrapped her arms around Danielle. Danielle's hand settled instinctively over her daughter's curls, but her eyes never left Evelyn. Neither woman spoke. Evelyn looked from Danielle to Grace, then back to the drawing still lying on the floor. Something cold and unmistakable settled into place. 6 years of unanswered questions about her son's private life. 6 years of Junho refusing introductions, avoiding family expectations, keeping parts of his home beyond even his mother's reach. Grace lifted her face toward Danielle. Mommy, is that Daddy's mother? Danielle drew a slow breath. Before she could answer, the front doors opened downstairs. A familiar male voice greeted one of the staff members. Grace's entire face brightened. Daddy. She pulled away from Danielle and ran toward the staircase. Evelyn did not move. Junho appeared below in a charcoal suit, one hand adjusting his cuff as he crossed the foyer. Then he looked up. He saw Grace first, Danielle second, his mother third. For the first time Evelyn could remember, her son's carefully controlled expression completely disappeared. Grace hurried down the final steps and reached for him. Junho lifted his daughter naturally, automatically, like a man who had done it 1,000 times. Evelyn stared at them. Junho stared back. There was no explanation left that could make what she was seeing ordinary. Then Grace smiled at Evelyn from her father's arms and asked the one question Junho had spent 6 years making sure she would never have the chance to ask. Daddy, is that my grandma? 6 years earlier, Danielle Carter had learned that wealthy people rarely needed to raise their voices to remind someone where she stood. Sometimes all it took was a glance at her uniform. She had been 25 then, working long shifts at a Kong family residence outside New York City, where polished marble floors reflected chandeliers worth more than everything she owned. Danielle arrived before sunrise, tied her natural curls into a neat bun, and worked until the dinner dishes disappeared. She needed the paycheck, but she refused to let needing something become permission for anyone to diminish her. Junho noticed her for the first time during a formal dinner his mother had arranged for business associates and family friends. Danielle was carrying coffee through the dining room when a guest named Richard Bennett looked down at the empty cup beside him. Finally, he said, "I have been waiting 10 minutes. Danielle stopped beside his chair. "I apologize for the delay, sir." She poured carefully and moved toward the next guest. Richard took one sip and frowned. "This is cold." The coffee was steaming. Everyone close enough to hear him knew it. Danielle reached for the cup anyway. "I can replace it. Perhaps if the staff paid attention instead of wandering around, we would not have these problems." A few guests looked away. Danielle had seen that reaction before. People often became fascinated by their plates when dignity became inconvenient. She removed the cup without argument. Then Richard pointed toward a dark mark on the white tablecloth near his plate. "And someone spilled wine here." Danielle looked at it. She had not served the wine. Another employee had accidentally tipped the bottle several minutes earlier, and Richard had watched it happen. "I can replace the cloth after dinner," she said. "You should have been more careful." Danielle paused. Across the table, Junho lifted his eyes. He expected her to apologize again. Instead, Danielle remained perfectly calm. "I will gladly correct anything that is my responsibility, sir. But I did not spill the wine." The room became quiet enough for the soft music from the adjoining room to suddenly sound louder. Richard stared at her. "Excuse me. I said I will fix the tablecloth. I simply will not say I caused something I did not cause." There was no anger in her voice. That made the words stronger. Evelyn Kong watched from the head of the table, expression unreadable. Junho watched too. He had spent his life surrounded by people who agreed with powerful men before those men finished speaking. Danielle had less money than anyone at that table and more reason than anyone to remain silent. Yet she had chosen truth without disrespect. Richard gave an embarrassed laugh. "Your staff is unusually opinionated." Danielle lowered her gaze politely. "Your fresh coffee will be here in 1 minute." She walked away. Junho followed her with his eyes until the kitchen door closed. Later that night, long after the guests had left, he found Danielle alone in the kitchen wiping down the counters. "You could have lost your job tonight," he said. Danielle turned, surprised to find him there. "I know. Then why correct him?" She folded the cleaning cloth once before answering. "Because there is a difference between serving someone and letting them decide who you are." Junho said nothing. Danielle returned to her work. "Good night, Mr. Kong." She walked past him carrying a stack of clean towels, apparently unaware that she had just unsettled a man who was almost never surprised. Junho remained in the empty kitchen, listening to her footsteps disappear down the service hallway. He had seen Danielle dozens of times before that night, but until that moment, he had never truly seen her. After that night, Junho began noticing how often Danielle was awake when the rest of the house had gone quiet. Sometimes she was finishing laundry in the service room. Sometimes she sat alone at the kitchen counter during her break with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. For 2 weeks, he said little more than good evening. Danielle always answered politely and returned to whatever she was doing. Then one rainy Tuesday, Junho entered the kitchen shortly after midnight and found her reading a letter beside an untouched sandwich. "Bad news?" he asked. Danielle folded the paper immediately. "Just a bill." "You look worried." "Bills have that effect." He almost smiled. "You could ask for an advance." Danielle looked at him. "I could, but my mother taught me to ask for help after I have tried everything else." Her mother, Junho learned, lived nearly 40 miles away and had recently reduced her work hours. Danielle helped with groceries while also sending money to her younger sister, who was finishing community college. She did not tell him this for sympathy. In fact, he had to piece most of it together from short conversations over several weeks. Danielle learned things about him too. She learned he hated overly sweet coffee, slept badly before major meetings, and sometimes remained in his study until 2 in the morning because silence was easier than family expectations. "You have an enormous house," she told him one evening, "but you spend most nights in one room." Junho glanced around the kitchen. "You work in an enormous house and eat dinner standing up." Danielle looked at the sandwich in her hand. Fair point. That was the first time they laughed together. After that, their conversations became a quiet habit. 10 minutes near the kitchen counter. 5 minutes beside the back staircase. Coffee after everyone else had gone upstairs. Junho never asked Danielle to treat him differently, but she did anyway. Not disrespectfully. Honestly, When he complained about a family dinner, she told him attending one meal would not destroy him. When he mentioned people constantly asking him for favors, she replied, "Maybe that is what happens when everyone thinks you can fix everything." "Do you?" he asked. Danielle shook her head. "No. I think you are just a man with better suits than most." Junho laughed so unexpectedly that Danielle stared at him. Something shifted after that. He began arriving home earlier. Danielle began leaving a fresh cup of coffee near the kitchen whenever she knew he had been working late. Neither called it affection. Neither needed to. But the distance between Mr. Kong and the maid was becoming harder to maintain. One night, Danielle found him sitting alone at the breakfast table long after midnight. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." "I am working." "So am I." Danielle looked around the empty room. Sitting in the dark, Junho leaned back. "My mother wants me to meet someone." Danielle understood immediately. A woman. A suitable woman. That sounds romantic. He smiled faintly, then became serious. "My life has always been arranged around what is suitable." Danielle rested her hands on the back of a chair, but did not sit. "Then maybe you should decide what matters before someone else decides for you." Their eyes met across the table. For the first time, the silence between them did not feel professional. Danielle broke it first. "Good night, Mr. Kong." She turned toward the service hallway. "Danielle." She stopped. He had never used her first name like that before. Not as an employer calling an employee. As a man asking another person to stay for one more moment. Danielle slowly turned back. Junho had spent his entire life surrounded by people drawn to his name, his influence, and everything attached to them. The woman standing 20 feet away wanted none of it. And that was precisely why he was beginning to want something from her that power could never guarantee. The chance to be known without the title. By the time Junho finally asked Danielle to dinner, almost 8 months had passed since their first conversation in the kitchen. He did not choose a private club or an expensive restaurant where his name would turn heads. Instead, they drove 40 minutes outside the city to a small family-owned place where nobody recognized him. Danielle wore a simple navy dress. Junho left his usual charcoal suit at home. For 2 hours, they ate pasta, talked about childhood memories, and laughed about how strange it felt to sit across from each other without a coffee pot or cleaning cart nearby. What began quietly stayed quiet. Their relationship grew through Sunday drives, late dinners, handwritten notes, and conversations that lasted until neither remembered what time it was. Danielle eventually left her position at the Kong residence because she refused to build a relationship with the man who signed her paycheck. Junho respected her decision. More than that, he admired it. A year after the night he first truly noticed her, he stood beside Danielle in a small courthouse with Daniel Brooks and Danielle's younger sister as witnesses. There were no chandeliers, no photographers, and no family announcement. Junho slipped a simple wedding band onto Danielle's finger and promised that secrecy would be temporary. Outside, beneath a pale spring sky, Danielle held his hand and asked the question she had been carrying all morning. "How temporary?" Junho looked at her. "Only until I can make it safe." Danielle understood what he meant. His world was built around reputation, family expectations, and people who treated marriage as strategy. Evelyn had already spent years suggesting women she considered appropriate for her son. Danielle knew becoming Junho's wife would challenge more than tradition. Still, she tightened her fingers around his. "I can live privately," she said. "I cannot live like something you are ashamed of." Junho answered immediately, "I am not ashamed of you." "Then promise me this does not become forever." "I promise." At first, hiding felt almost harmless. They moved into Junho's private estate, away from the residence where Danielle had once worked. Inside those walls, she was not an employee. She chose the furniture, argued with him about leaving coffee cups in his study, and laughed when he pretended not to enjoy the old soul records she played on Sunday mornings. Then Grace was born. The first time Junho held his daughter, Danielle saw tears gather in the eyes of a man who had spent his life training himself not to reveal anything. He became gentler at home. He learned how to warm bottles at 3 a.m, how to walk through the hallway with a sleepy baby against his shoulder, and how to abandon an important phone call when Grace reached for him. Outside the estate, however, nothing changed. 1 year passed. Then 2. Whenever Evelyn asked whether Junho was seeing someone, he redirected the conversation. When family gatherings appeared on the calendar, Danielle stayed home. When Grace became old enough to ask where Daddy was going, Junho answered, "Work." By the 4th year, Danielle stopped asking when he planned to tell his mother. By the 5th, the silence itself had become an answer. One evening, shortly before Grace's 5th birthday, Danielle stood beside the bedroom window while Junho adjusted his cuff links for another family dinner. "She cannot stay invisible forever," Danielle said. Junho stopped. "I know. You said that last year." He looked toward the hallway where Grace was singing to herself. "I am protecting both of you." Danielle turned toward him. Her expression held no anger, which somehow made the words harder to avoid. Protection should make someone feel safe, Junho. It should not make them feel hidden. He had no answer. 6 years earlier, Danielle had asked him for one promise. She had never demanded his money, his influence, or his family's approval. She had only asked not to become his secret forever. And Junho was beginning to realize that every year he waited was turning his promise into the very thing she had feared. Grace began asking about her grandmother 3 weeks before her 5th birthday. It started with a photograph she found inside a drawer in Junho's study, an old picture of him standing beside Evelyn at a formal family gathering. Grace carried it into the kitchen where Danielle was slicing strawberries. "Mommy, who is this lady with Daddy?" Danielle looked at the photograph and paused. "That is your grandmother." Grace's eyes widened. "I have a grandma." The innocence of the question landed harder than Danielle expected. "Yes, sweetheart." "Where does she live?" "Not very far away." Grace considered that. "Then why have I never seen her?" Danielle set the knife down and wiped her hands. For years, she had protected Grace from the complicated truth by offering simple answers. Grandma was busy. Daddy's family lived differently. Some introductions took time. But Grace was no longer satisfied with answers that disappeared the moment she examined them. "That is something you should ask your father," Danielle said gently. That evening, Grace waited beside Junho's chair until he finished a phone call. Then she placed the photograph on his desk. "Daddy, does Grandma know about me?" Junho became completely still. Danielle stood in the doorway, watching him. Grace climbed onto the chair beside him. "Does she know my birthday is next month?" Junho looked into his daughter's dark eyes and saw trust without suspicion. She had no idea that adults could love someone deeply and still make choices that caused pain. "Not yet," he said. Grace frowned. "Why?" He could negotiate with people who arrived prepared to challenge every word he spoke. He could manage businesses, settle disagreements, and make decisions that affected hundreds of employees. But he could not find an answer for a 5-year-old asking why her grandmother did not know she existed. "It is complicated," he finally said. Grace looked at Danielle. "What does complicated mean?" Danielle's expression remained calm. "Sometimes it means grown-ups waited too long to do something difficult." Junho looked at his wife. She did not accuse him. She did not need to. Grace returned her attention to the photograph. "Would she like me?" Junho's face softened immediately. "Of course she would." "Then can I meet her?" Silence. Grace waited. Danielle waited. Junho looked toward the window, where evening light stretched across the lawn. "Soon," he said. Danielle lowered her eyes. She had heard that word before. Later, after Grace was asleep, Danielle found Junho standing alone in the hallway outside their daughter's room. "You cannot keep giving her the same promise you gave me," she said. "I am trying to find the right way. There will never be a perfect way." Junho turned toward her. "My mother will have questions." "She should. She will judge you." Danielle held his gaze. "People have judged me before. This is different." "No, Junho. It is different for you." The word stopped him. Danielle stepped closer, her voice quiet. "I know who I am. I know I am your wife. I know Grace is your daughter. You are the one still living as if those facts need permission." Junho looked toward Grace's closed door. Danielle continued. "I can forgive being private. I cannot teach our daughter that love should hide." For the first time, Junho understood that the secret was no longer contained between two adults who had once agreed to wait. Grace was old enough to notice the empty spaces in her own family. The next morning, she sat on the hallway floor with crayons scattered around her, drawing 3 people beneath a yellow sun. She carefully wrote Daddy above one figure, Mommy above another, and Grace above the smallest. Then she added a 4th figure near the edge of the page. She stared at it for several seconds before writing one uncertain word above it. Grandma. Grace smiled at the drawing, unaware that before the day was over, The woman represented by that single purple word would walk through the front door. The front door opened shortly after 2 that afternoon, and Evelyn Kong entered the estate expecting a 15-minute conversation with her son. Junho had missed another family lunch, and after receiving 3 vague responses from his assistant, Evelyn had decided she was finished waiting for explanations. She handed her coat to a surprised housekeeper and noticed immediately that the staff seemed uncomfortable. "Where is Junho?" she asked. "Mr. Kong is expected back shortly, ma'am." Evelyn glanced toward the staircase. "Then I will wait." She had taken only a few steps into the hallway when she saw Grace sitting on the floor surrounded by crayons. The child looked up. Evelyn stopped. Something about the girl's face felt familiar before Evelyn understood why. The dark eyes, the thoughtful stare, the slight tilt of her head. She looked like Junho at 5 years old. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked. "Grace." The little girl gathered her drawing and stood. Evelyn's attention dropped to the paper. For figures now stood beneath the yellow sun. "Daddy, Mommy, Grace, Grandma." Evelyn stared at the final word. "Who is Grandma?" Grace pointed directly at her. "Maybe you." Evelyn's breath caught. "Why would you think that?" Grace smiled. "Because Mommy said Daddy has a mother." Before Evelyn could ask another question, Danielle's voice came from the far end of the corridor. "Grace." Evelyn turned. Danielle stopped beneath the archway, and 6 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition. Evelyn remembered the young Black Maid who had once worked inside a Kong residence. But the woman standing before her now wore no uniform. A simple cream sweater, dark slacks, a wedding band. Grace ran to her. "Mommy, I found Grandma." Danielle's expression tightened. "Grace, sweetheart, come here." Evelyn looked at Danielle's hand, then at the ring, then at Grace. "What is this?" Danielle rested one hand on her daughter's shoulder. "This is something Junho needs to explain with me." "With you?" Evelyn repeated. Grace looked between the two women. Sensing tension she could not understand. "Mommy, is she really Grandma?" Danielle hesitated only a second. "Yes." Grace's face brightened. "I knew it." The joy in her voice made Evelyn's anger falter. She had expected deception, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps some complicated explanation. She had not expected a child to look delighted simply because she had discovered a grandmother. Then the front doors opened downstairs. Junho entered, speaking quietly to Daniel Brooks. Grace heard him immediately. "Daddy." She ran toward the staircase. Junho looked up and saw Evelyn. His expression changed. Grace reached him, and he lifted her into his arms with effortless familiarity. Evelyn watched her son kiss the top of the child's head. There was nothing uncertain about the gesture, nothing newly discovered. He was her father. He had been her father every day of her life. Evelyn slowly approached. "Junho." He met her eyes. Danielle remained above them on the staircase. Grace smiled and touched her father's collar. "Daddy, Grandma came to see me." Junho closed his eyes for one brief second. Evelyn noticed. "How long?" she asked. Junho said nothing. "How long have you known about this child?" His eyes opened. "Since the day she was born." Evelyn looked toward Danielle. "And her?" Junho followed his mother's gaze. Something in his posture changed. Not fear. Decision. "Danielle is my wife." The hallway went completely silent. Evelyn stared at him as though she had misunderstood the language. "Your wife?" "Yes." "Since when?" Grace rested her head against her father's shoulder while Junho looked directly at the mother he had spent years avoiding. Danielle did not interrupt. She had waited long enough for him to speak this. Truth himself. Evelyn repeated the question, quieter this time. "How long?" Junho tightened one arm gently around his daughter. 6 years. Evelyn's face lost all expression. 6 birthdays. 6 Christmas mornings. 6 years of family dinners where her son had arrived alone and allowed everyone to believe that was how he lived. She looked at Grace, then Danielle, then back at Junho. The secret was over, but the silence it had created was only beginning to demand an answer. Evelyn did not raise her voice. That made the silence in the sitting room feel heavier. Grace had been taken upstairs by the housekeeper with her crayons and drawing, leaving 3 adults surrounded by afternoon light and 6 years of unanswered questions. Evelyn sat in a high-backed chair near the windows. Danielle remained beside the fireplace. Junho stood between them, though for the first time he seemed unable to control either side of the room. 6 years, Evelyn said. "You married without telling your family." You had a daughter without telling your family. Then you sat across from me at birthdays, holidays, and dinners as if none of them existed. Junho held her gaze. I had reasons. Reasons? Evelyn looked toward Danielle. Was this your idea? Danielle's expression remained calm. No. You expect me to believe you wanted this family to know? I wanted my husband to tell you himself. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. And for 6 years you simply waited? Danielle drew a slow breath. I waited because I loved him. That does not mean I agreed with him. Junho turned slightly toward her. Danielle continued before he could speak. I never asked your son to hide me. The sentence changed the room. Evelyn looked at Junho. Then whose decision was it? He did not answer immediately. Danielle had spent years carrying the visible cost of a choice she had not made. She had stayed home while Junho attended family dinners. She had answered Grace's questions. She had watched promises become delays and delays become years. Junho finally said, Mine. Evelyn leaned back. Why? He could have spoken about privacy. He could have mentioned reputation, family expectations, or the complicated world surrounding his name. Those explanations had protected him for years. Now Danielle was standing 10 feet away, and none of them sounded honest enough. Because I knew what you would think, he said. Evelyn's face hardened. You do not know what I would have thought. I knew what you expected. The right family. The right background. Someone you could introduce without explaining. Evelyn glanced at Danielle. And instead you married a woman who worked in this family's home. Danielle did not look away. I was a maid. I am not ashamed of that. This is not about shame. It became about shame when my husband decided the safest place for me was somewhere nobody could see me. Junho's eyes lowered. Evelyn looked between them, suddenly realizing that Danielle was not standing there asking for approval. She was asking Junho to own what he had done. I was never ashamed of her, he said. Danielle's voice remained quiet. Then why did our daughter have to discover her grandmother from a photograph? He had no answer. Evelyn turned toward her son. You said you were protecting them. Junho nodded once. I believed I was. From whom? The question landed cleanly. Junho looked at his mother. Years of avoidance disappeared behind a single admission. From you. Evelyn went still. Junho continued. I was afraid of what you would say about Danielle. I was afraid you would make her feel as though loving me required proving she belonged. I was afraid you would look at Grace and see a complication before you saw your granddaughter. Evelyn's eyes flashed with hurt. So you decided for me? Yes. You took 6 years from me because you were afraid of a conversation. Junho's jaw tightened. Danielle looked at him, and when she spoke, her words were gentler than Evelyn's, but harder to escape. And you took 6 years from us too. Junho turned toward his wife. Danielle's eyes were steady. You keep saying you were afraid of your mother. But Grace and I were the ones who had to live inside that fear. Footsteps sounded on the staircase. Grace appeared at the doorway holding her drawing. She looked from her grandmother to her parents. Is everybody mad? Danielle immediately crossed the room and knelt beside her. No, sweetheart. The grown-ups are finally telling the truth. Grace considered that, then walked toward Evelyn and held out the picture. I drew you too. Evelyn stared at the purple figure labeled Grandma. Her expression changed. Grace had included her before ever meeting her. Evelyn slowly accepted the drawing. Junho watched his mother hold the first gift her granddaughter had ever given her, and for the first time he understood the full cost of his secrecy. He had spent 6 years fearing what truth might destroy. He had never stopped to count everything his silence had already taken away. Danielle packed one suitcase the next morning. She did not slam doors, raise her voice, or ask Junho to follow her from room to room. That almost made it worse. Grace sat on the bedroom rug placing books and stuffed animals into a small pink backpack, while Junho stood near the doorway, watching the life he had protected in secret prepare to leave him in plain sight. Where are you going? He asked. Danielle folded one of Grace's sweaters and placed it inside the suitcase. My sister has a guest room. For how long? I do not know. Grace looked up. Daddy is not coming. Danielle paused before answering. Daddy has some things he needs to figure out. Junho stepped farther into the room. Danielle, we can figure them out here. She finally looked at him. That is what I have been doing for 6 years. The words were not cruel. They were tired. Junho had heard anger before. He knew how to respond to demands, accusations, and threats to his authority. But Danielle was not asking him for anything. She had reached the point where promises no longer carried enough weight. I told my mother the truth, he said. Because she walked through the door and saw Grace. Danielle's eyes held his. You did not choose the moment, Junho. The moment chose you. He had no answer. Grace quietly zipped her backpack. Danielle knelt beside her. Sweetheart, this is not because of anything you did. Is Grandma mad at us? No. Is Daddy? Danielle glanced toward him. No. Your father loves you very much. Grace considered that, then walked to Junho and wrapped her arms around his waist. He crouched and held her close. I love you more than anything, he whispered. Then come with us. Junho closed his eyes. Danielle looked away. He could command meetings, rearrange schedules, and make entire rooms wait for him to speak. None of that could repair what Grace had just asked. Danielle was right. Power had become useless here. By noon, the suitcase was in Danielle's car. Junho stood on the front steps as she buckled Grace into the back seat. What do you need me to do? He asked. Danielle closed the car door gently. Stop asking me to tell you. He frowned. I do not understand. That is the problem. For 6 years, I told you what I needed. I needed our daughter to know her family. I needed to stop disappearing whenever your world came near ours. I needed you to choose truth before circumstances forced it out of you. Her voice softened. I still love you. But Grace is watching us now. I will not teach her that loving someone means accepting a place in the shadows. Danielle got into the car and drove away. Junho remained on the steps long after the taillights disappeared beyond the gates. That evening, the estate felt larger than it ever had. Grace's crayons were still on the hallway floor. Her unfinished drawing rested on the table. Danielle's coffee mug remained beside the kitchen sink. For years, Junho had feared that telling the truth would cost him his family. Now silence had done exactly that. 2 days later, Evelyn returned. She found her son alone in the breakfast room, staring at Grace's drawing. Where are they? She asked. Danielle left. Evelyn sat across from him. Because of me? Junho shook his head. Because of me. For once, he did not defend himself. Evelyn looked down at the purple figure Grace had labeled Grandma. I was angry when I learned the truth, she said. But not because Danielle was once a maid. Junho looked up. I was angry because my son decided I was unworthy of knowing my granddaughter. The words settled between them. Evelyn touched the edge of the drawing. You were so afraid I would judge your wife that you never gave either of us the chance to know each other. Junho stared at the empty chair beside him. He finally understood that an apology would not be enough. Danielle did not need another promise whispered behind closed doors. If he wanted his wife and daughter to return, he would have to build a life where neither of them ever needed to hide again. 3 weeks later, Danielle's car turned slowly through the gates of the Kong estate. Grace sat in the back seat wearing a yellow dress and holding the family drawing against her chest. Danielle had almost declined the invitation. Junho had not asked her to come home. He had asked whether she would attend a family gathering and promised that she could leave whenever she wished. That difference mattered. As the car approached the house, Danielle saw several vehicles along the circular driveway. For 6 years, gatherings like this had been the reason she stayed behind. Today, Junho's relatives and longtime family friends were already inside. Danielle parked and stepped out. Grace immediately reached for her hand. Is Grandma here? Yes. Is Daddy? Danielle looked toward the house. Yes. Grace smiled and started forward. Danielle did not. Her eyes had fallen on the side entrance near the service wing. She knew that door. Years earlier, wearing a maid's uniform and carrying folded linens, she had entered through it so many times that her feet could still remember the path. For one strange moment, 6 years disappeared. She was 25 again, reminding herself to work hard, remain polite, and never confuse service with surrender. Then the main doors opened. Junho stepped outside. He wore a charcoal suit, but there were no advisors beside him and no carefully arranged explanation waiting on the steps. He walked down alone. Grace released Danielle's hand and ran toward him. Daddy! Junho crouched and caught her, holding her tightly before kissing her forehead. I missed you. I missed you more. Impossible. Grace laughed. Danielle watched from beside the car. Junho stood and took Grace's hand, but he did not approach Danielle immediately. He gave her space to decide whether she wanted him closer. Finally, Danielle walked toward them. Thank you for coming, he said. I came for Grace. I know. His answer surprised her. No defense. No request for forgiveness. Just acceptance. Junho looked toward the open front doors. Everyone inside knows. Danielle's expression changed. Knows what? That I have been married for 6 years. That Grace is my daughter. That you are my wife. Danielle searched his face. And what did you tell them about why nobody knew? Junho did not hesitate. The truth. That hiding our marriage was my decision. That you never asked for it. Grace looked between them, impatient with adult seriousness. Can we go see Grandma now? Junho smiled faintly. Yes. He extended his hand toward Danielle. He did not grab hers. He simply offered it. Danielle looked past him at the main entrance, then toward the side door one final time. The difference between those two entrances had once defined her place in his world. One had been for family and guests. The other had been for people expected to remain unnoticed. Danielle slowly placed her hand in his. Grace immediately took Junho's other hand, linking the three of them together. They climbed the front steps. Conversations inside softened as they entered. Danielle recognized several faces from years earlier. Some looked surprised. Others smiled uncertainly. Junho did not release her hand. At the far end of the foyer stood Evelyn. Grace brightened. Grandma. Evelyn's expression softened before she could hide it. Grace hurried toward her and held out the drawing. I brought this for you. Evelyn accepted it carefully. Then she looked at Danielle. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Finally, Evelyn stepped aside and opened the path into the gathering. Danielle, she said, welcome. It was not forgiveness. It was not 6 lost years restored in one word. But it was a beginning. Danielle looked at Junho. This does not fix everything. I know. Trust takes time. Then I will give it time. She studied him, searching for another promise too large to believe. He offered none. Grace returned and slipped between them, taking both their hands again. Together, they walked farther into the house. 6 years earlier, Junho had believed secrecy could protect the people he loved. Now he understood that protection without dignity could become another kind of fear. Danielle had never needed him to give her a place in his world. She had needed him to stop hiding the place that had already been hers. And that afternoon, for the first time, his wife and daughter entered his family life through the front door, where no one could pretend not to see them.